The proof is out there. Seek the proof.
Hey, welcome everybody. We are live. This is episode 5 of The Proof is Out There, Seek the Proof. I got with us tonight my good friend, the lovely and talented Amanda Bryant from Moonshiners Master Distiller, and a good friend of ours, Mike Dombrowski, aka Distiller Woody.
Hey guys, how you doing?
Hey, glad to have you, man. Glad to have you.
Appreciate the end.
Uh-oh.
Right, definitely.
Oh yeah, cool, awesome. Thought you froze up there for a second.
Where'd Amanda go?
We lost Amanda. She's having a little difficulty, but she'll pop back in. So
my bad.
Oh, you're good. You're good.
Having some technical difficulty. I can't get anything to work over here.
Yeah. How's everybody doing tonight? Everybody doing okay?
I'm doing great. Yeah, I'm good.
Good to have you. Thanks for joining us again, Amanda.
Yeah, always. Thank you for having me.
Definitely great to see you guys again. It's been a long time.
Oh yeah, it's been a little bit. Last time we got to hang out was in Maggie Valley.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun down there.
Yeah, it was. All right, so tonight's topic, that's why we have Woody here. He's the yeast guy. He's all about brewing bugs. So I'll just let Woody tell us a little bit about your, if you would, a little bit about when you got started, your history, some of the things that you've done through the years, a little bit about yourself.
A little history. My history, like a lot of other moonshiners out there, goes back to the late 1800s. My great-grandmother was a midwife in Pennsylvania, small coal mining town. She would make rye whiskey, as everybody in Pennsylvania did, for treating patients. But her twist on it, she would make laudanum. Back during the snake oil salesman time, everybody put anything into their alcohol, and they could treat arthritis, rheumatism, gout, everything. Laudanum is basically an opium infused alcohol,
right?
And my grandmother used to make that, and
wow, she
taught my great grandmother how to make rye whiskey. And growing up in a coal mining town, the only way you got out of that town is if you did something outside the coal mine community, because you got paid in company chits, CHITS. And my grandmother would make her rye whiskey. Now, she made her rye whiskey started around 1916. And then when the pandemic broke out, she would soak her gauze mask in the rye and as a nurse would treat the patients.
Oh, wow.
Never got sick, and from there, she taught my uncle on my dad's side how to do it, and then from there, my uncle taught me. I started, hanging out with my uncle as a young lad up at the farm. They would give me little small packages of yeast, and I'd have to go run and get this, run and go get that, and stuff like that. I never knew what the hell was going on. I did help my dad with wine back in those times.
Cool.
Also, my uncle worked for a company called Kyers Beer out of Mahoney City, Pennsylvania. So he did a lot of brewing there, as well as the distilling aspect, which he taught me later in life. But when I was younger, it was more or less the wine and the beer. I wasn't witness to the hard stuff. Wasn't until it was like the late 80s, early 90s when you started hearing about it. I did have my very first thing they gave me as a young kid was a little package of wine yeast and a ball lock. And watching my dad do elderberry wine and huckleberry wine back in the 70s, late 70s, I would take, if you remember, Hawaiian Punch came in cans.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I tried that with the wine yeast. It's not too good. Hawaiian punch fermented. But that was a young kid. I started doing it that way, experimenting and having fun. I went to college and learned about a bunch of stuff. Worked at a company called Mobile Oil Corporation in Princeton while I was going to college, and there we worked on distilling ethanol as an alternative gas additive. Also worked on Mobile One synthetic oils. Did a lot of synthetics byproducts testing there. Went to Japan, came back, hooked up with my uncle again, and we got back into the distilling. He taught me a lot more, and in the early 90s about the distilling, and ever since then just been going hog wild, beer, wine, mead, and any type of spirits you want me to make, and just been going nuts on that.
That's awesome. When I first met you and over at Maggie Valley with Amanda, you had a sample of yeast with you at that time, and was I believe it was a pine cone yeast. Yeah. And we sat and it was crazy because Mike and I sat and talked like we've known each other for forever, and it was just that kind of a connection. And he has so much knowledge, and that's why he's here.
Appreciate that. Appreciate that. Yeah.
So you want to Mike, you want to go through and start talking a little bit about yeast, and you kind of got a deal laid out there.
Yeah, I kind of, the way, since a lot of your listeners are talking about spirits and proof. I look at it from different aspects, from the wine industry,
exactly,
brewing industry, mead, and then, into the spirits. Because once we get into lacto, there's lacto using that. That has a whole different venue. But most of the stuff we talk about in the distilling industry is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is basically an ale yeast. It's top fermenting yeast. It's the most versatile yeast you have out there. Damien, if you can go to, I guess, I got to get the right one.
Slide 2.
Slide 4. Slide 4. We're starting slide 4. So,
there you go.
Is it up? I can't say.
No, it's not yet.
All right.
There you go.
All right, there you go. Slide 4. That's basically corn whiskey. This is our standard whiskey yeast. And as you can see, as you put that in, you have the blue line on your left is the cell count for the yeast. The blue on the bottom. The blue line on the top is your sugar. As the sugar comes down, your yeast count goes up. As that's going up, you have your green going up, as well as your red and your yellow lines. Those are your esters, your fusel oils, as well as your alcohol or your ethanol. Your purple line is your diacetyl, which is your butterscotch, which you don't like in a spirit. So this is the model that you want to shoot for.
Okay.
Yeah, you had a question on that one, or just?
No, go ahead.
Did you have a question? Okay. All right. So this is the lines you kind of want to shoot for in a standard ferment. As the number count goes up, you want obviously your sugars to drop, your fusel oils, your esters, all those to gradually increase. The faster they increase, the more likely they are to create solvents, such as stuff that comes over in your heads, your acetone, acetates, all those nasties. So this shows a nice slow progression. Next slide, Damien. So in the next slide, this is the 5 major areas that we focus on. The 6 is your higher alcohols. Those comes off in your head. We want to keep that last column low. The higher these other 5 are, the higher the profile and flavor for each one appears. So the first one is that's an apple. I believe that's the apple. No, it's banana. The isoacetate. So is it banana? Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, banana. Good one. All right. Yeah. Usually anytime you listen to a bourbon steward or somebody who's tasting it, a bourbon, they all go through and they talk about the banana, pineapple, tropical,
Right.
apple, pear, floral, honey, creamy yogurt. All those things are the key areas that bourbon steward look for. So I'm kind of looking at those as what the primary outcome is based on each yeast style you use. So as you go forward in each different yeast style, it's going to fluctuate. Now, if we went to a lager yeast, which is more clean, all these numbers would drop.
Mm-hmm. That's a
All right. So
bottom fermenting yeast, correct?
that's correct. Basically, Cervezi or Saccharomyces goes from 65 to 78 degrees. Saccharomyces pastoranus, which is the lager yeast, goes from around 44 to 60, but you can actually push that to change it. You can actually go lower if you really want to. Anytime you use a lager yeast, because it's bottom up fermenting, it's very clean. It drops your yeast, dead yeast cells out, flocculation, and attenuation is a little bit slower because the yeast is a little colder and it actually eats the sugars at a slower rate.
Can I stop you, Mike?
Go
I'll
ahead,
stop
jump
you.
in there.
Okay, so you said some terminology, what I want to give definitions for. You said flocculation and attenuation. And these are words that we use in my class, but some people may be like, what the heck are you talking about, right? So
Exactly.
attenuation is like the yeast ability to basically
how vigorously it
Yeah, go ahead.
work off the alcohol. Work off the alcohol. Attenuation, high attenuation means it's gonna eat the most sugars,
Right.
Yeah.
and it's gonna bubble the most.
And these are like, for those of you at home, when you're selecting a yeast or you're looking for like, what is the right yeast for the job, right? Are you fermenting sugar? Are you fermenting grain? Are you fermenting fruit? And basically, Mike is an expert at different types of yeast that are great at fermenting different types of ingredients. And the way that you would choose is you would look at the yeast and what the yeast properties are. So the properties are a little bit of what Mike is talking about, which would be the attenuation or the yeast's ability to consume the sugar and make alcohol. Flocculation, Mike, is that when all of the yeast bodies fall to the bottom of the fermentation, right? And it kind of clarifies.
Drop that, yeah. It clarifies, drops out of suspension. There's multiple ways to do it, but normal flocculation is measured in the yeast strain itself without any byproduct to actually push it through.
Right. And also,
so if you have something with,
oh yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Temperature can help it.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
You mentioned temperature, right? So temperature is another yeast
right.
property.
That's another way of. Yep.
Of choosing your yeast.
Ideally, right, and choosing your yeast. Ideally, most of the yeasts that people are going to be using for distilling are going to be from anywhere from 68 to 75 degrees.
Right.
If you want to go to a different range, you're going to have to push it, but it's also going to create different flavors than what you'd see on the screen.
I was going to mention a while ago when you were talking about ale yeast, and before you went into the lagers, that oftentimes people they can control certain things about their ferment by temperature and and yeast pitch rate. So there's
right.
There's a lot of ways to shape it. It's what we use for our ferment, but there's a lot more to it than just a yeast.
Correct. I mean, you can actually manipulate your flavors, and like I say, you have these 5 bars there. You can manipulate your flavors and the amount of esters,
which is kind of what
your
the
mash
in the bottom
by
there,
actually modifying your yeast. You can add so many yeast cells, high ABV, and you want to stretch the ferment time out longer to increase esters. Yes, you do. But it also depends on how much alcohol you got, what type of yeast. Ideally, you do want to push it out to make the yeast eat at a slower rate, and it's not stressing the yeast. Anytime you stress a yeast, it actually gives off flavors, and it actually increases your solvent output or your nail polish, so to speak.
Right. The heads. It can produce those bad alcohols.
Correct.
When stressing the fermentation or stressing.
Correct. Yep. Yeah. Anytime you stress yeast, An average life cycle. Okay, yeast is a eukaryote cell, and it doesn't mate by meeting in another bar and seeing another yeast cell and saying, "Hey, you look good." Basically, what yeast cells do is they bud. They reach a certain maturity level, they create another yeast cell. All yeast cells are considered mothers, and every bud is considered a daughter. A yeast on a typical life cycle will produce anywhere from 20 to 40 buds off the mother cell. Now, during fermentation, because it's a shorter time frame, you're going to try and get maybe 4 to 6 buds out of those yeast cells, because the more buds you get, the more scar tissue you get on the cell wall, and it's a little bit more of a struggle for the yeast to actually produce the offspring. So it actually creates some off flavor. So it reduce some of your esters and increase some of your high alcohols, which is the nail polish.
Can I ask a question on that? So basically, I have heard, so the yeast budding, right, is one way that they're reproducing, but the yeast can also split in half, correct? And replicate themselves by splitting. So they can bud or split.
No, it's bud. They don't
only bud.
They only bud. Splitting is within the cell. The what is it? The mitosis for smaller celled organisms do it by splitting. Because these are multi-celled eukaryotes, they bud.
Okay.
And that's why, because you cannot. Well, I shouldn't say you cannot. People, like, if you buy an ale yeast, and if you go to White Labs, you might see a strain that is not a single strain. It's a dual strain. You will get a Hefeweizen yeast that might be 2 strains in one pack, and sometimes that's good. For beer, in distilling, it's the same thing, but you can actually manipulate it yourself by adding so many of, let's just say, a homegrown yeast, and let that go for 3 to 4 days while it gets most of the compounded esters out, and then throw a distiller's yeast in there to finish it off.
Hey, Mike, you
got basically
co-pitching yeast then.
Yeah, co-pitching.
Yes, yeah.
We had a question real quick. So you can see that there. So if you're using an ale yeast, can you extend the fermentation time by adjusting the temp to slow it down, or do you want to keep a consistent temp all along the ferment period?
You definitely want to keep a consistent temp all along. Slowing it down doesn't do anything. By cooling it, it actually stresses the yeast out a little bit. Yeast has a standard rate. Most wild yeasts are about tolerant up to 4% alcohol. If you throw it into something at a higher alcohol potential, it could stress the yeast out and create off flavors. So if you start slowing it down and you go below its standard, temperature range, it's going to cause the yeast to stress out and throw off some off flavors
in your product or your fermentation that you're currently fermenting. Yeah,
that's correct. Yeah.
But now, you can, like we've spoken about, Mike and Mike Dombrowski, actually, we used to do little experiments together, and he taught me about laboratory or advanced laboratory evolution of yeast. So if you're propagating your yeast, you can intentionally cold ferment a yeast and force it to reproduce and bud at a lower temperature. But this is during propagation, right? So this is going to create off flavors, and it's not going to affect the product, the whiskey or the brandy that you're trying to create. But what it can do is you can force the yeast to survive in a colder temperature, so that then you have a yeast that is advanced or has evolved to survive in colder climate. You can do the same thing by feeding it different kinds of sugars like molasses, or feeding it a different type of grain, but you can during propagation, feed it what you want it to ferment and keep it in the temperatures where you want to ferment it. So you can slow fermentation, but that's something that you do maybe when you're propagating it to withstand a colder temperature, and not when you're making an alcohol that you want to consume. Because like Mike said, it's going to create, anytime we stress that yeast we give it temperature outside of those recommendations, it's going to make bad flavors for us.
Correct. Yes. And if you're gonna you can take a regular store bought yeast, and if you want that yeast to produce at a lower temperature, you can actually, like Amanda said, propagate it. But you're gonna gradually reduce your temperature each propagation. So you got, propagation 1 is at 68 degrees. Propagation 2, you're going to put it at 65 degrees. Propagation 3, you're going to put it at 62 degrees. You're going to gradually bring it down until your yeast is not stressed out at those temperatures. It's kind of like I created a wild yeast from the farm that actually will ferment down to 38 degrees.
Wow.
So basically, if I leave something out in the farm, I'll just throw this yeast in there over the winter and let it go. I've had pine cone yeast going at 62 degrees.
Wow.
Wayne, don't you have a very cold fermenting yeast right now? A very active one?
Yeah, actually, that's how I found it. It was in a fruit compote that we had in a Tupperware type dish in the fridge, and I opened it up. I was telling Mike about this the other day. I opened it up, and our Jen did, and she's like, "Oh, this is fermenting," and I was like, "It's been in the fridge. How in the hell?" So I said, "Let me see it." So she handed it to me, and I took a sniff, and it smelled beautiful. I tasted it. It tasted really good. I was like, "Don't worry about it. I got this." So,
I would love for Mike to elaborate a little bit more about the pine cone yeast, because another thing that I learned about and experience from Mike personally. So my relationship with Mike is, or Woody, distiller Woody. I was trying to nail down Martha Washington's cherry bounce recipe, and a farmer, actually, a friend of mine from Dancing Star Farms, he recommended that I contact Mike Dombrowski. He said he makes really good the Colonial Cherry Bounce, and he's in your area. He's a great distiller. Call him. He'll help you. I literally called this man, and he was like, "What do you need?" I got cherries. I got honey. I got yeast. He introduced me to the most awesome kind of yeast, right? So right off the bat, first conversation I ever had with this man, he was offering knowledge. He was offering ingredients. He's like, "You need it now? I'll drive it to your house now." That's how helpful my introduction to Mike was. And then I continue to go to him with questions. So one of the many cool things that I learned from Mike in my friendship was he just does all these crazy experiments, right? So he's always got a mad scientist experiment going on in his basement, and he ferments different kinds of pine cones. And I thought this was really fascinating because I hadn't heard about this, but he's essentially like capturing wild yeast. So if you want to capture wild yeast, you can do it from anywhere in your environment. You can use raisins. You can use fruit. You can use grains, malted grains. You can capture wild yeast pretty much on anything, but Mike is doing it on different types of pine cones. For me, I thought it was amazing. One of the coolest things I saw, because the alcohol coming off these pine cones in the propagation tastes like fruit striped gum. Okay? Like literally, or juicy fruit gum.
that is crazy.
So delicious. He gave me a sample in a jar that I have at home, and I'm going to let you talk about this now, Mike. But when I first got it, I thought it was super interesting. All different pine cones produces different yeasts, and apparently this yeast, not every wild yeast is ideal for alcohol production. Right. However, Mike taught me that the yeast that comes on pine cones can be more likely to be ideal for alcohol production, meaning it can produce more alcohol. And I do want to talk about yeast properties at some point, like alcohol tolerancy, temperature tolerancy, things like that. But Mike, talk about this pine cone propagation and what you were doing, traveling around and collecting pine cones, and talk about how you do it, your method, like how you add the sugar to it, because I think people would really find that interesting.
This is actually goes back, I would have to say 500 years. If you guys ever in the Italian Alps, up towards where they're playing the Olympic Games right now, Milan and north of there, they used to make this stuff called Magulio. They would get young, fresh pine cones in the spring, mix it with either demerara or some type of sugar, allow the sugar to absorb all the actual moisture out of the pine cones.
So no additional water, right?
No additional water. So it would actually absorb everything. Hold on a second. Give me a second.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm not at home, so I don't have mine, but I thought about that. It'd be so cool to show. Of course he's got
Yeah.
one.
Yeah, you know he does.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got one. Yeah. All right. If you can see it.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So basically, you do an equal amount. So if I got if I just say I got 2 pounds of pine cones in here, these are spruce pine cones. I get 2 pounds of sugar. It could be brown sugar, demerara, any type of sugar. I don't like using white sugar because it has chemicals in it. To me, it has chemicals in it, and it creates off flavor. So I use the most natural, and just let it sit. After you let it sit, the natural yeast that is in there, I collect that. And I will start that and I'll use that for a batch going forward. But the reason I'm using that is because it withstands a higher pH. So I can actually use that yeast at a higher pH. I can go to like a 6.3, 6.4. I can start that high and it'll ferment all the way through. But with that, once you're done with that, you drain the sap or the fluid off the pine cones, and you put it in a double oven, a Dutch boiler or whatever you want to call it. You steam off the liquid, so it's a little bit more thick in the syrup, and then you bottle it, and that's Muguglio itself. The Italians put that on top of pork, meat, venison. Fantastic.
Nice.
That's that real sweet flavor. Like it's fruity, it's sweet. You would think it would taste like pine cones, but actually the flavor that comes out of it is incredibly fruity and complex.
Yes.
And is this similar to the soda, right? So you can do the same type of fermentation where you're making like a natural carbonated soda, but with water.
Yes.
Similar,
yes.
Yeah.
Using the spruce tips.
Yeah.
Okay. So not the pine cones, the tips. Gotcha.
Yeah. Yeah, but I could do this with the pine cone or with the spruce tips as well. But this, I've actually fermented it alone, and actually, you do get a little bit of pine, but it's like you said, Amanda, it's mostly citrusy, like fruit striped gum.
Yeah, we got a question for you there, Woody. It says, will a wild yeast from a fruit or grain carry some of that post-ferment flavor to the thing or flavor of the thing it came from? Like, does your pine cone yeast give off a bit of pine flavor if you ferment it with just a grain?
It's if you use an apple and you get the yeast off of an apple, only when you ferment the apple will you get that apple flavor. If you try and take a fruit strain or a yeast strain off of a fruit and ferment that onto a grain, you will not taste any of the fruit that you originally pulled it from. I'm saying that right?
Yeah. So basically, I think also to answer that question in a different way would be the yeast will eat the sugar and make alcohol based on whatever kind of sugar the yeast consumes, and the alcohol will take on the flavor of the ingredients that the yeast consumes. The yeast will affect the flavor of the final product because the yeast has benefits, right? So certain yeast will contribute fruitiness, floral notes. Right. So yeast can affect your flavor profile, but your final product or the alcohol is coming, the flavor impact most is coming from whatever that yeast is eating, not necessarily from the yeast. So if that yeast eats apples, it can carry over the flavor profile of apples. Wild yeast can carry over fruity and floral esters, but pine cone yeast will not carry over a flavor of pine cone unless you're putting pine cones directly into your mash, which you wouldn't do. You would culture the yeast coming off the pine cones and then propagate that yeast by feeding it some type of fermentable sugar. Any alcohol produced would taste like whatever fermentable sugar you're feeding it: fruit, molasses, grains, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, you mentioned, Amanda, the word cultured. So we had a comment here. It says most wild yeast is not as good or effective as cultured yeast from what I've seen.
Yeah.
But you can take the wild yeast and like we talked about, and you propagate that and you can increase its attenuation. It mutates. And so.
Yeah, it does. I mean, most of your wild yeast, like I said, I don't know if I said this or I thought I said it. Most of your wild yeast are tolerant up to about 4% alcohol.
Yeah.
If you want to, adjust, and it also depends on when you're getting it too, because you can get a spring yeast and compared to a fall yeast. Fall yeast, is a little bit more hearty, has a little bit more cold tolerance,
Right.
and you can push the boundaries of it a little bit. Spring yeast is just, it's fresh, it's just awakening, it hasn't built its immune system up from traveling the air, you know what I mean? So you're basically getting a stronger yeast in the fall. If you are getting a yeast specifically from fruit, ideally it should stay with the fruit. If you are doing it from a grain, it usually stays with the grain, because again, if you go directly from a fruit yeast into a grain yeast, you're going to create some stresses, so you might create some off flavors or esters that you don't really want to carry over.
Yeah,
And also go ahead, Wayne. You talk.
I was just going to say, I've got a apple yeast that I've had for 2 years now that I got from the local orchard where I gathered apples. I got apples for in the fall for my brandy. And so that yeast is like I said, I messed with it and propagated and got it now where it'll handle a fairly high gravity. I typically don't worry about that with apple brandy, but just playing around with it to see what it can do. And so, it does really well, but the first time I used it, it didn't have that, it wasn't all that powerful. It did ferment and finish it out, but my must was just fruit. So it was the specific gravity of the apples, to begin with, and it worked out really well.
And that's a different type of sugar. That's fructose that that yeast is eating, and it's used to it, and just it sees that's opportunistic, and I mean, this is for me personally. Adding sugar to a mash, I what they call it, sugar shine or something like that. People add sugar to their. I know a lot of people do it, and they boost their alcohol. What happens to the yeast in that situation? If you have sugar in there, yeast will start eating the simple sugar first. They're going to go for your glucose first, and what's going to happen is as it produces the esters from the glucose or from the simple sugar, the yeast is going to be kind of acclimated for that simpleness, and it's going to figure like, oh, this is pretty easy, I'm just going to go through life. But then once it eats all those simple sugars up, it's got to go through the maltose or the sugars from the grains. So it actually can stress the sugars out a little bit and actually increase your nail polish in the front, and give you off esters on the backside.
And whatever the yeast is eating, that's what your alcohol is going to taste like. So when your yeast eats those different ingredients, and alcohol only has, your yeast, depending on where you get it from, what kind of yeast you have, will have an alcohol tolerancy. So for example, say you're using a yeast that has 10% to 12% alcohol tolerancy, right? And then people are like, I don't understand why it doesn't taste like this, right? So if you give it all the simple sugar, like Mike just said, it's going to eat all the simple sugar. It's going to make a slightly sweet, neutral flavored spirit. Once it consumes all that sugar, it will then move on to the more complex sugars. It will then start to eat the sugar from the grain or the sugar from the apple. So it's just to keep in mind, it just matters on how you build your mash bill, right? The simple sugar is there to guarantee you're going to get volume back, and have a successful fermentation for people who where the volume and the quantity is important. But that's an interesting point, that when the yeast has to switch from eating a simple sugar to a more complex sugar, there's a period of stress that occurs, which I've never really thought about.
Yeah, it's kind of like, you're feeding the wild animals out front. You're throwing the corn out for them. They're used to seeing that, hey, it's free meal. This is easy. By the time they have to go fend for themselves, they're struggling. They don't know where the hell to do or where to go.
Yeah.
Right.
I wanted to talk about the propagation a little bit, because we had discussed that. That's a big topic that people really are very interested in.
They are.
When we talk about yeast propagation, I always like to say, like, go back to a time when there was no internet, there was no stores. Where were you getting your yeast from if you were a distiller? So historically, the distiller's job, and I believe I probably got this from Alan Bishop, he did a whole thing that I saw very early on, and when I was educating myself on distilling, about propagation of yeast. The distiller's job was the keeper of the yeast. If you had a distillery or you were a moonshiner and you were deep in the Appalachian Mountains, you were in an isolated area, and this was going back before a time period where we had commercialized yeast in stores, right? I think Fleischmann's was developed. Fleischmann's opened in 1868. So before we have Fleischmann's bread yeast, right?
Right.
What did they do? Distillers would capture wild yeast from their environment. They would propagate it, and propagation is how we develop a wild yeast that we can make it stronger, essentially, where we're feeding it something, and the yeast is going to continue to create stronger and stronger yeast bodies, like the survival of the fittest almost, through evolution. But when you capture wild yeast, initially what we start with, and some people say wild yeast are not good. So most wild yeast may not be ideal for alcohol production. They don't produce a lot of alcohol because they don't have a high alcohol tolerancy. Something that people are like, what kind of yeast should I use? Alcohol tolerancy is something that we look at to decide how much fermentable sugar we want to feed our yeast. So every yeast has an alcohol tolerancy. The alcohol tolerancy means simply, right, how much alcohol can this yeast make before the environment becomes too alcoholic and the yeast stops working. So 10%, once my mash gets to 10%, it's going to slow down and stop working. Some yeast can survive higher to 15%, 18%. There's turbo yeast that claim that they're going to give you 20%. In the case of a turbo yeast, what's going to happen is there's a lot of additional nutrients that's going to stress the fermentation, force it to force feed and force eat, and create too much alcohol too fast. Like Mike has said, stressing the fermentation is going to create off flavors. But there's also different kinds. So you don't always have to start with a wild yeast when you're propagating. And for most of us that are distilling at home, if we were to propagate in our garage or in our yard or wherever we're making a lot of mashes, and we set yeast traps. So this is how you would do it at home. You would make a sterile yeast trap. You can use a mason jar. You would make a very sterile mash. What is the gravity you want to give the mash, Mike, so that it's ideal for the wild yeast?
4% alcohol potential.
Okay.
That way the yeast will land on there. You catch it the next day. Me personally, how I do it, I would catch it in a mason jar with the beer in there. I take an inoculation loop, and Amanda, we sat down and did this at the house. Take an inoculation loop, which is a little thing that has a little loop on it. You heat it up, basically clean it off. You dip it in, and then you get an agar plate, which basically it has on the bottom is a thin Jello-like beer at 4%, and it's like Jello. So I scrape the
agar on the plate.
Yep, agar.
Okay.
You scrape that across. You go around all the way around, and you let the yeast grow on there. And once it grows, you take that off, and you start propagating it through Erlenmeyer flasks. Flask like this. You fill this up. I usually, if it's a wild yeast that I've never played with before and I don't know what the hell it's going to taste like, I might do 5 to 10 of these and inoculate and just see, what does it taste like, and take the top 2. All right, at 4%. These are the top 2 at 4%. I want to go to 5%. So do the next batch at 5%, start propagating at 5%. This is the advanced laboratory evolution that Amanda was referring to. So just keep, doing 5 to 10, take the best 2 onto the next level, until you get, to your appropriate level where it's fermenting at the right temperature, it's fermenting at the right rate, fast, or slow, depending on what you want. It's got the bright ester profile you're looking for, whether that's banana, tropical fruit, apples, pears, stone fruit, whatever. I mean, everything is right. And then you take it to your final destination, do a small 5-gallon batch, run it through your still, see what it tastes like, and then go from there. Then you can adjust accordingly. That is how you actually propagate and continue to grow the yeast strain until you find something you really like.
And it's pretty easy early on to know, one, if you've captured something, because you're going to see activity in your yeast trap. You're going to see bubbling, right? So that's how you know right away if you have something. You can look at the activity compared to other yeast traps. How active is it? How much activity are you seeing? And you can also tell pretty early on, have I captured a good producing yeast or a bad producing yeast? Because a good yeast will smell like alcohol and will give good flavors. A bad yeast will, aromas, I mean, a bad yeast right away will either turn to vinegar or start to give really bad aroma. So if you're trying to learn how to propagate yeast at home, making yeast traps and mason jars, setting them at different areas of your property, check them after a day for activity, and then just monitor them, right? Like you can trap yeast in your garden is a great place to try to propagate a wild yeast. But use your nose and your senses. Visually, what am I seeing? What am I smelling? And if it smells good, keep it. If it smells bad, get rid of it.
Dirty sweat socks, gym bag, definitely drop it. Yeah.
Yep. And there's also the propagation of
I did have one that did smell. It originated. It smelled like I said, dirty sweat socks.
Mm-hmm.
And the third or fourth subset of that, it came out incredible. And I don't know what the hell happened, but I mean,
hung in there for the long run. Though
I was just like, what the hell?
Trooper.
Yeah. Well, I would just want to see how bad I can get it, really, and it just it evened out. Really, I got lucky on that one.
So we can also propagate like store-bought yeasts. So what for me personally, I'm not propagating wild yeast, so to speak. I have done experiments where I propagated wild yeast, but the ones I'm most commonly propagating are specifically yeast like Kvike or the 1895C yeasts. These are yeasts that are expensive to purchase and they are easy to propagate, but they're expensive to purchase, right? So we're talking maybe what is a Kvike on average is like $10 for 5 gallons. Yeah. So that's, so in order for us to afford that, it's very easy to propagate that yeast. So we purchase this yeast once and then continue to propagate it through a cycle of fermentations or propagate it in something like a Donna jug off to the side where we're feeding the yeast, and we always have a yeast starter. So yeasts that are capable of propagation are fantastic because you don't need to buy yeast anymore, and you can use really good working yeasts. You don't have to keep paying that expensive amount for it. So propagation is cool to have, but also good to know how to do if you don't want to keep purchasing yeast, if you're at a place where you can't access yeast or you don't have it. And it's a way of being self-reliant is what it really comes down to.
Yeah. I was going to say, I mean, a way to capture it on your batch as it is going through the ferment, just right after your cap falls. Just take a little scoop from the top, and then after you draw it off and throw that into a still or wherever you put it, you have your trub on the bottom. Take some of that. Once you got that trub and some of the top, basically get some distilled water, mix it in there, shake it all up, put it on its side, let it sit there for like a day, and the trub will sink out and you'll still have suspended yeast cells in there. You take that and then you start adding sugar and flour, depending on what your next batch is going to be. If you are going to be doing corn, I do a corn flour. If you're going to do a rye, use rye flour, wheat, and you get the right flour to keep adding. If whatever you're using that yeast on, you want to maintain that grain contact as you move forward.
I also like to recommend, though, the experiment, right? Like the Kvike yeast is a mead yeast. It works great for honey fermentations. It's also considered an ale-style yeast, I believe. But if you throw that at grains, it can do wonderful things for grains. It can bring out fruity aromas and flavors. This is also an experiment, right? It's not always going to do nice things, but sometimes it does. If you were to take a brandy yeast and put that in your whiskey, then it can sometimes contribute the properties of the brandy. Right? It can bring over fruity and floral aroma and flavor and contribute that to your whiskey. Like Mike's saying, it could stress because you're feeding it something that it's not recommended to do. But sometimes you're going to create positive flavor profiles as well. Just as often as you may create negative flavor profiles, there's always a chance you could create a positive flavor profile with experimentation.
Sometimes you got to risk it. You just got to play around with those yeasts and see what they can do. Mm-hmm. We had another question here, Mike. Is there any lab made?
Is there any lab made yeast to avoid? Is it better than the long run? Can you? Yeah. Anything with pH positive, it's phenol off flavor positive. So if you are making certain beers, if you ever have like a I guess they're called, I forget what they're called, but you have yeast that give you either a spicy or a clove aroma. Those are the phenol positive yeast strains. So every yeast strain that you should use should be a pOH negative phenol count. That way, what happens is the pOH positive takes the, if I say this right, ferric acid and creates 4VG, which gives it its spiciness. And if you overdo that in a spirit, it creates a wet rope type flavoring.
And how can you find a yeast? Where is this in like yeast? So I always recommend people to make it easy. People are like, how can I find out what this yeast does? How can I find the right yeast? So if you go online and you just Google the type of yeast you want and look up the yeast properties, usually it'll give you a lot of information on that yeast.
Right.
What is its alcohol tolerancy? What is its temperature range? What kind of flavors can it contribute? Where can you find that information that you're talking about, Mike?
Usually it is in the manufacturer's book. I'm trying to think. I mean, I can slide. See if I can try to do this. Nope, from my computer. No, never mind. Yeah, I didn't share this with Damien. I have a spreadsheet that I put together. Kind of gives you the name, the blend, what type of a strain is it? Is it a blend? Is it a single strain? Yeah. What's your attenuation percentages, your flocculation, ideal temperature ranges, and the flavor profile. And also gives you within that, is there, is it a pOH positive or pOH negative yeast strain? Anything. I mean, you talk about like rye whiskey. Everybody's, it's spicy. Rye has a heavy amount of these. Was it ferric acid? I skip. Rye has a heavy amount, and that carries over but it's not due to the actual yeast causing it. It's the aldehydes in the oak extraction and the tannins that cause the dryness of the rye to give it its
tannins
spice.
That are present in the grain. Tannins
right.
Present in the grain. I know right. Barley has the most tannins out of those grains. Yeah. The husk does.
Yeah, the husk has a lot of tannins on barley.
I know some people will drink Irish or Scotch whiskey and say, I got a really bad hangover. Well, and I have heard, or I've been told, that it's because of the level of tannins that barley contains, that it has more tannins than other grains, specifically corn, right? So you could drink a bourbon or a corn whiskey, and it has, I'm not sure about the levels, but I know that the small grain, specifically barley, has high amounts. But that's what's causing that pepperiness or that spiciness that you're saying. That's interesting.
Yep. Does a fish pump help with yeast oxygen? Yes, short blasts. Also,
but how much oxygen is too much oxygen, and what can that do to your fermentation?
That's a good question.
You can over-oxygenate. Yeah, you can over-oxygenate, and basically it kind of, again, stresses the yeast out. Too much oxygen. It's got to be a fresh balance. You can use an O2 with a stone. If you use, Home Depot has those red tanks that you can get. It's almost like a MAP gas tank. Mm-hmm. You could do like 5-second blasts of that in there. Just do like a couple quick 5-second blasts. If you're using oxygen to promote or advance your yeast in a mash, I would only do about like a minute or two.
Yeah.
How frequently?
Every hour.
Really?
Maybe. Yeah.
See, not that much. Because people are always afraid of airlocks and sterilization, and the mother vinegar enzyme is present in oxygen. So I say, like, if you are going to, you need to stir your mash once a day or every other day at the most. It's more necessary with fruit because you want to avoid too much oxygen introduction because it's going to increase your chances of getting a contamination from
infection.
Vinegar enzymes. I don't recommend the air stone in a fermentation. I recommend an air stone if you need to like oxygenate your alcohol once it's been distilled. But in a fermentation, and it's just if you use it, you have to be very careful how much oxygen you're introducing, because the oxygen is what carries the bacteria and the vinegar enzymes that we don't want introduced into the fermentation. That's what even open fermentation has an airlock, because when the yeast is developing alcohol, it releases carbon dioxide gas. The carbon dioxide gas is heavier than oxygen, so it sits as a barrier on the surface of the mash, and it keeps oxygen from penetrating in and being introduced into your mash and contaminating it and allowing it to vinegarize, essentially. So even open fermentation has a natural airlock occurring with that headspace that's in your barrel.
There's two things. The fish pump is pumping air through. So air has oxygen, nitrogen, and other gases within it. An O2, like if like my mom's on the O2 mask, for her heart or stuff like that, you definitely do not want to use the O2 medical
purified
device.
Oxygen,
yeah,
or concentrated oxygen,
right? Because that's when you start getting the access to your vinegar, your Scooby, so to speak, because it starts. That oxygen will actually fester.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, I recommend just avoiding it entirely to people unless you're very experienced or you find a reason. What reason would you give that you would find the need to introduce additional oxygen to a fermentation?
Tequila, rums, anything where you need extra nutrients.
Okay.
Osmotic, and where you might have osmotic pressure from the sugar.
Right.
And
that can occur when due to temperature fluctuation, right? Like when the temperature drops, then those thick sugars can recoagulate. Is that right? Throwing the yeast out of equilibrium.
It does throw the yeast out of equilibrium, but it is like if you get to for like tequila or for rums, what happens is yeast cell has a permeable membrane for water can go in and out. So what happens when you have too much sugar on the outside and not enough water, the cell tries to equalize the pressure, and without the proper nutrients for the yeast to actually equalize hydrolysis, it actually expels water from the membrane to try and equalate the pressure, and actually dehydrates itself and goes into stress. Yeah. Did I explain that right, or did I just do a lot of these?
You're explaining osmotic pressure. What Mike is explaining is osmotic pressure. Right. And the way that you resolve this issue, which it's common, and specifically you see this when you're doing rum fermentations or agave, like he had mentioned. But this can occur. This is when all of a sudden your yeast your mash or your fermentation, it stalls. The fermentation slows or stalls. Most commonly, it's a pH issue, but if it's not your pH, then it could be the osmotic pressure occurring. And then to introduce oxygen is a way that you can correct that. Reintroducing oxygen or oxygenating your mash and then pitching some fresh yeast can help pick the fermentation back up. But yeah, that would be a time when to answer that person's question, you're not just like ripping air into any fermentation. Most commonly, it's not going to aid your fermentation. It's not going to help your yeast. In the very beginning, when you pitch yeast, we oxygenate our mash by stirring vigorously. That little bit of oxygen introduced in the beginning is going to help jumpstart your fermentation and activate the yeast bodies. Right. But after that, there's not really a necessary need to introduce fresh oxygen periodically throughout the fermentation. It should just kind of do it on its own. Unless you're seeing an issue with fermentation, then we go back and address that issue, right? I mean, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree. I maybe I should have asked the right question. How big of a mash? Because, I mean, if you have a small mash too, okay, like you said, 55-gallon drum, you throw a little drill in there and get a nice stir going and get your vortex going. If you're using 300-400 gallons, you're gonna throw some compressed air.
A little different. Yeah. I've seen people misunderstand that concept, or I know people that are like, I got this fish air pump and I put it in my mash, and they're talking about like 10, 15, 20 gallons, and I recommend that you don't need to add air to your mash. Like unless you run into an issue where your fermentation has stalled and you're addressing that the issue is your mash needs oxygen, which is a pretty rare occurrence for most of us. home distilling. It's pretty rare.
Yeah.
Yep.
When I do mine, when I go from my mash tun or my cook pot, I bucket it over into my fermenter, and when I dump it into my fermenter, that's the oxygenation that it
Boom. Yeah.
gets. And when it's full and it's done, I put the lid over top of it and let her go.
That's all you need. Just a couple back and forth through the buckets, and that's enough. To get the air going.
I definitely want to, Wayne, I wanted to ask you to talk about how you are doing yeast logs. So if you're propagating yeast or you have liquid yeast and you need to store it or extend the shelf life, there are some ways that you can do that. And I think that this is a really cool traditional technique.
Yeah. So the yeast log is a Scandinavian thing, as far as I've gathered. I mean, basically, it's where the Kvike yeast is a good example that is stored on yeast logs. In fact, I just sent a sample of my yeast to Woody, and he's going to start playing with that. Which I used a lot of Kvike out here, so and it was a deal where I had a lacto that I didn't want, and so I cleaned all my equipment, cleaned the area, everything I could clean, make sure everything was clean, did a new mash, transferred to mash, made sure my buckets, everything was clean, transferred it to the fermenter, put the lid over it, let it cool down. I came back over and it was just, it was booming. And so it smelled really good. It smelled like it ought to smell. And I've been working with that yeast for the last year. And a lot of times, like the day that I empty my fermenter to strain and run, I've also mashing in, and I put it right back into the fermenter. I don't worry about pitching any yeast. I don't worry about anything because it's already there. Mm-hmm. And I've been doing that and keeping that going. I keep a live culture in the fridge, but I'm piggybacking ferments into that yeast bed that's there, and it just goes. It rocks. Now that's maybe not the best way, but that's what I've been doing for the last year or so with that one.
And yeast can survive in wood for a very long time, thousands of years even.
Yep. That's also what you also get in there, and this is another thing, is Brettanomyces. Because Brettanomyces loves wood sugar. And that is another thing that you can add to your yeast to actually give you different flavors. Brettanomyces, that was a big thing. Actually, little story. Sorry, excuse me. Brettanomyces actually means British fungus.
Okay.
It was actually discovered in Carlsberg, Denmark, right around 1904. That it is actually a yeast strain. It does a lot of fermentation of dextrins and cellulose. So it does. It is higher alcohol tolerant than regular Saccharomyces. It does need a lot more time, though. Saccharomyces can actually ferment out maximum maybe 14 days. You're looking at starting 13 days, 16 days when the Brettanomyces kicks in.
Are these commonly producing off flavors or a funk in fermentation for us? So it can be like a foreign bacteria that might not.
It does create a funk, but if managed properly, I mean, you have to be on top of it. It has to be consistently maintained. There is cross-contaminate risk. You need to monitor it. When and if it's done and completed correctly, and you age that, it ages, so it gives it a certain type of, how do they say, maturity with your spirit that just using regular yeast and lab does. It gives you a better mouthfeel, more rounded. I've heard that from people who've used it. I've used it once and in my time, and I screwed it up. Like I said, you got to be on it. I mean, I had my regular job. I couldn't be on it all the time. And it's a hard thing to do. Now, lab kind of does the same stuff, but I'm definitely waiting to try your stuff. Now, we talked about your yeast log. You said you did it with rye.
Yeah, that's well, that mash was rye and oats, and yeah.
Okay, because I have rye malting right now. I'm just
Mhm.
throwing it on the kiln. So after I do that, I'm going to do a mash in, and once I get that, it's about 100 and what's the alcohol range you're looking at for yours?
Oh, usually my gravities I shoot 1060 to 1070. I usually 1065 is a sweet spot.
Okay.
So that's
Sorry,
about
I'm taking a sidetrack here because I want to make sure I do this
You're
right.
fine.
Right.
We got a question for you though, Woody. If you have a big enough fermenter, would fermenting under pressure solve the equalizing problem from rum or tequila ferments?
Equal, like putting
Yeah,
that one. No, I mean it's because you basically what's happening is your yeast is stressing out. It doesn't have enough nutrients
Yeah.
to fight. It's like its immune system is down.
Creating
adding
a healthy
some,
fermentation would be what you would do, right? You would
Right. Yeah.
make sure it has the proper nutrients, make sure you're starting at a proper pH with the expectation that your pH is going to drop.
Right.
Especially with molasses and agave, we see a pH crash commonly occurring. So healthy fermentation is a number one thing, and then preparation, and make sure that your fermentation has everything it needs so that throughout the expectancy of the fermentation, whether that's 14 to 21 days with the complex sugars, that it's going to maintain good nutrients, maintain good pH balance. Those are the things that will cause it to kind of to fall apart and disintegrate, or have
Right.
that osmotic pressure to occur.
Right.
Malted grains is a good source of nutrient, even especially for a sugar wash like that. I mean, I know most people wouldn't think about putting grain in rum, but just think about it.
Yeah.
You're not going to notice a couple pounds or a pound or so of grain,
Yeah.
and it gives nutrients for the yeast.
I think they call that FAN or YAN, yeast available nitrogen nutrients, or free free amino nitrogen or something like that. Yeah, I mean you definitely need that. I mean, what I've done in high gravity rums or agaves, you use dimonium phosphate, which is a yeast nutrient, or you can go to the dollar store, get a female multivitamin. For every 10 gallons, you throw a pill in.
Yeah, I've done that.
I think it's also why distillers do so that rum is traditionally done sort of like how sour mashing is done, where they're taking some of the spent mash or the dunder from the pot, and they're contributing that into the next fermentation. So every time you make a new mash with molasses, you're taking some of the spent mash. It's going to do one thing. It's going to add flavor because those sugars have caramelized in your pot. So it's going to help add a complexity of that caramelization flavor. But what's also present is yeast nutrient, because there are dead yeast bodies in the spent cooked mash. And those dead yeast bodies are the best, easiest nutrient that you can give the yeast, is to feed it a nutrient of itself, of dead yeast, because yeast is cannibalistic, and it's the easiest thing for the yeast to consume. You can make yeast nutrient at home by cooking your yeast at a low temperature in the oven, just enough to kill it. You can add it into boiling water. Or you can just give it a healthy dose of spent mash. Be careful not to put too much spent mash in there, because it can create too much of an acidic fermentation. But just the right amount can give a pH buffer and can give you a good dose of nutrient. So rum is commonly done like that generationally, where it's almost like a sour mash. You're putting back in a certain percentage into the next mash, and boom, that's like a natural source of yeast nutrient, pH stabilizer right there for you, that can help with a healthy fermentation and avoid issues.
Back when I was doing, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was going to say, well, that goes right into lactobacillus, pediococcus. That's how you're introducing you have that pH buffer in there, and you're going to get those creamy esters, and that helps round out the rum. So
yeah, speaking of esters, I used to keep a dunder bucket or a muck pit, whatever you want to call it, and it had the funkiest crap on the top of it, and I would siphon out from underneath the cap, and I would add a portion of that back to my water that I was heating up for I didn't know what I was in there, so I heated it up to kill off any bacteria, but the acids are still there, the esters, the things that create those nice flavors that you want in a rum. The muck pits, people get grossed out by them, but it's all about esterification and acids.
Mhm.
There's muck pits down in Central America or the islands. Guys, birds fly into them. They don't
Yep.
fly out.
They
Yeah.
put their food in there.
Yeah.
Like all the, and originally I think the muck pits on the islands were they're very secretive, I found this interesting. If you want to go to the Caribbean, you want to go to a Caribbean rum distillery and you ask them, tell me about your muck pit, let me see your muck pit. They are not going to let you do it. Even if you're like, you got to know someone who knows someone to get in there and see that. It's so secretive because I think essentially what it is, it's a compost pit, right?
Yeah.
They're composting waste.
Right.
They're dumping the spent mash into these pits. They're taking the waste from the food, from the employees. And we're going back. Let's go back a couple hundred years, right? When they were first began distilling rum, they would make a compost pit on the island and they would put everything in it, including the spent mash and the dunder. And what they realized was this became a good source of esters and bacteria that they then began contributing back into a new fermentation. But they don't let anybody see that. Probably because it's just so gross.
It is pretty gross. But my wife, I was doing rum with a friend of mine. He had I guess you can't really call it rum, it's sorghum. But I made sorghum spirit, and I did a spiced version, and she loved it. Jen was like, you got to make more. And I was like, well, I can't get any more sorghum and it's really expensive, but yeah, she really loved it. But it was the stuff that I made with the muck pit, and it was so rich and flavorful, and she just really enjoyed that.
Yeah. There's different yeasts for all different fermentations, right? Like you can go and you can buy special yeast for whiskey. You can buy special yeast for rum. You can buy special yeast for fruit. And each of these yeasts have different yeast properties that benefit you in the fermentation of that ingredient. So, for example, the fermentation of fruit, I have a list of topics. This is on there. Fermentation of fruits. When we're fermenting fruit, it can be a complex sugar and it can create off flavors, but specifically, it can create higher concentrations of acetaldehyde or heads in the fermentation. And I would like to ask Mike, why is it that we go and we look for fruit yeasts, right? Like what is the fruit yeast doing? Brandy yeast are creating less heads for us because why?
Brandy
Why is
yeast.
that?
Well, it's funny because we talked about this. We talked about this back 7,000 years ago when they were first doing fermentation in China, based on the study and based on the archaeobiology that they found that they used a natural yeast from hawthorn. We talked about the hawthorn grapes being so the actual grapes and fruits they used to create all of our original yeast strains. So originally, the hawthorn fruit was the primary yeast strain that was our historical, yeast strain that took the root for everything else. So when you are using a yeast strain that comes off of apples, if you go back generation through generation, it has that root back into the hawthorn. Now, the hawthorn fruit, from my understanding, it was a wild fruit, and it created a lot more volatiles. And that was the volatiles were for protection of the fruit from certain species of animals from eating it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Interesting.
And for preservation of the seed coat. Because I don't know have you ever seen a strawberry where the seeds are on the outside and the actual strawberry actually sprouted? There's a chemical reaction that actually prevents the seed from sprouting, and it actually has to do with the yeast strain. I don't know I was talking to one of my friends. He just passed away, Dr. Patrick McGovern. He did a lot of archaeobiology. He was giving me this whole thing about how yeast, in one respect, is there to break down the apple or break down the fruit, but it was also on the seed to protect the seed from sprouting while in the fruit.
Okay.
And because of those chemicals, that is what you're talking about as far as getting the additional nail polish remover, the high esters or the high
Okay.
alcohols.
And you can choose yeast. You can look up the yeast property. You can look up a cider yeast, a brandy yeast, a
Yeah.
specific type of yeast for fruits. See that property, read the yeast properties on that yeast, especially when fermenting apples. This is helpful to make sure that you are getting a type of yeast that's going to counteract the effects of fruit fermentation, which is one effect of fruit fermentation is we get back a lot more heads. So the type of yeast you choose can counteract that, bring out fruity flavors, and produce less heads for us. Wayne, I'm sorry.
Isn't there something with fructose too? And the fructose giving you
The
more
fructose
heads?
conversion into ethanol alcohol will always produce more heads than sucrose or the glucose and the sugars and the starches and grains. For some reason, we see even molasses, the conversion of molasses can produce more heads. And that's why most brandy and rum is stored even clear for up to 2 years to help it mature or age and kind of get rid of that bite that comes off. But definitely you see a lot more heads produced in that fructose conversion to ethanol alcohol. I don't know if it's just a harder conversion to do or more complex sugar that's being converted, but it does produce more acetaldehydes.
Here's another question, Mike. At what point does yeast shift from respiration to fermentation, and what cellular signals trigger that metabolic switch?
Wait, put that back up there again and read that. At what point does the yeast shift from respiration to fermentation? What cellular trigger minima?
Is that when they're reproducing, like in the beginning?
I think he's asking when do they quit budding and just go to?
Oh, they're going to continue to bud. They're budding continually. As soon as you put them into a yeast starter, before you actually add them, they're propagating. They're adding more and more yeast cells. Your yeast cells continue to grow. So
they're both happening at the same time, respiration and fermentation.
Respiration and fermentation are going on at the same time. And it's just a natural thing. I mean, they're going in, have a certain number that go into the mash. They see the sugars, they're going to start chowing down on them. They're going to be happy and start popping off these little buds. Mm-hmm. That's if I understand that question correctly.
I think they're both occurring at the same time. As they're respirating, they are that is fermentation.
It's the actual process itself.
Crabtree effect.
Never heard of that one.
I didn't go to college for this. I'm not sure what that topic is, but that's something that I will definitely look into and I will read about. I would like to talk about the history. How one thing I find fascinating about yeast is that we have thousands of strains of yeast, right? And some of those strains have been alive and being used for thousands of years. Mm-hmm. And some of those strains of yeast that we found were thousands of years old. We've been able to bring back to life and use today. So there's a really common, the 1895C was the yeast of grape skins in a bottle of wine from Switzerland. They opened the bottle and reactivated it in 2008. And if they had not done that, the yeast was in its crystallized form. So the story is that a gentleman at a prestigious event opened a very vintage bottle of wine, vintage year 1895 is where the name comes from. The vineyard is no longer there. The types of grapes grown in that region of Switzerland on that vineyard are now extinct. Sediment was in the bottom of the bottle of wine, and a microbiologist was present, saw the sediment in the bottom of the bottle of wine and said, "Can I keep this? I'd like to culture this and see what it is. I want to run tests on it." It turned out that it was actually yeast in a crystallized form. So they were able to reactivate that yeast in 2008. They tested this yeast. So when we're propagating yeast, catching wild yeast, and whenever we find something we think is a new strain of yeast, they'll send it to a lab and see if it's a known strain. And it's very unlikely that it's an unknown strain. It's very rare that we get an unknown strain of yeast. Well, when this happened in 2008, they realized when they tested it, this was a new strain of yeast. It was an unknown strain of yeast that we had not yet documented, and it had been at the time, because in 1800s they were crushing the grapes and using the yeast present on the grape bodies, right? So this would have been an extinct strain of yeast if it had not survived in its crystallized form. And the fact that it did, it's almost like the Jurassic Park story, where like the DNA is in the amber and we extracted it and brought it back to life. Did yeast make civilization possible?
Wait, before you go on, you're talking about the grapes, and I was reading an article, and they were talking about when I forget what island it was. It's an island off the coast of Gibraltar, and they were stepping on the grapes like they did traditionally, and it was the yeast that was on your skin, because yeast is on our skin.
Yeah.
It was the yeast on the feet that was actually contributing to the flavor of this wine.
Interesting. Yeah. So, but yeah, so I love that story because it's the most recent historical event regarding yeast where we found the undocumented strain of yeast. And what's amazing about that story is if that little bit of yeast hadn't survived, and if that scientist hadn't seen that sediment and thought, hey, let me test that, we wouldn't have this yeast available today. You can buy this yeast online. It's 1895C. It's sold in a 1 pound brick. I got a small sample of it last year, and I was able to start experimenting with it and propagating it. It's fantastic for fermentation, especially fruits. I have used it in whiskey, but it's really easy to propagate, and it's really easy to play with. Feed it different things and see what happens. It's a really fun one. Did yeast start civilization? That's a great question. And they go back to, did it make civilization possible? Thank you. There's the whole, what came first, the bread or the whiskey, right? Has everybody heard this?
Yeah.
Go for it. Yeah.
What do you think? What do you think came first, Mike? Bread or whiskey, and why?
I think
this is kind of the topic of
not whiskey. I think beer came first.
Beer.
I think beer came first because we knew how to convert in China, and I'm going back to Dr. McGovern, who did this. He basically analyzed pottery shards that they found from the Zhuhai province in China, and they identified that inside the yeast, or what was in the actual jar and fermented, was rice, honey, hawthorn berries, and barley. And the barley was malted. And this was, if I remember correctly, it was 9600 BCE?
Okay.
So almost 10,000 years ago.
Yeah. So I believe what made civilization possible was agriculture. I think that humans' ability to farm, plant crops, and then harvest those crops allowed people to stop being hunters and gatherers, right? So now they could stay in one stationary place, they could grow their food, and then they could take their food right from where they were living. And then people became more stationary. They could hunt from that location, but essentially agriculture, or the ability to grow crops, is what really started civilization, people being able to settle down, no longer have to be nomadic. I think beer fermentation, right? Are we talking about fermentation? I think that, or yeast,
right.
I think that has been, so it goes back to like the 4th century BCE. We're seeing talk about yeast and fermentation. And these are in poems that were stories told by word of mouth. There's talk about the gods, the goddesses of beer and beer gods, where they're talking literally about this is the oldest documented forms of alcohol that we can find in these poems, or these verbal words of mouth that were shared. They're talking about making beer or wine, but I think it was beer first, like you said, Mike. But that, if you think about, like, use common sense, right? Would humans have developed beer first or bread? Because they could use baked bread, and they learned that was breaking down the starches that was allowing them to make alcohol more easily. It's a tough question. Which came first, the chicken or the egg?
Mike mentioned that the beer had malt in it, so they knew that malted grains would give them conversion. We were talking also about some of the Asian cultures, and Mike and I have talked about this quite a bit. We use malted grain to convert our other grains. but there's other things that these cultures do to convert their starches.
Yeah.
Mike, you want to expound on that?
Sure. Well, before we go into that, I just want a little history here for you. Most of the brewers, distillers, just so everybody knows, and I told this to Amanda. Most of the brewers prior to 1700s were all female. They were the priestesses that the one they brought it during the times in Egypt. If they wanted to, verify a woman was pregnant, she would urinate on barley and wheat. If the barley sprouted, she was pregnant with a boy. If the wheat sprouted, she was pregnant with a girl. So, I mean, it's been going on for years. But that, just a little sidetrack on that. I mean, I just want to have
interesting though. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
But you talk about the enzymes. The enzymes to do the conversion. We use malt, and the malt has the diastatic power.
Yep.
And it's kind of like each animal has enough chemicals in its brain for that brain to be put onto the skin that it actually tans the hide.
Tans the hide, yes.
Right. I mean, each living organism. So each cell has enough enzymes contained within it that allows it to convert its own starches into a plant, except barley 2-row, which is the predecessor, which has more diastatic power, which it converts itself and it can convert others. Now, in the Far East, China, Philippines, Korea, Japan, they used aspergillus.
Yep.
They used yeast, but they used aspergillus to do the conversion. Aspergillus is koji. Koji is big for making sake, soju in Korea, shochu in Japan,
right?
Awamori in Hokkaido. It's all different things, but instead of using malted grains, the koji is basically it's a fungus that needs starch to start out on. But once it starts growing, and just think of it like as the root starts growing, it starts feeding off of protein, amino acids, sugars, whatever is in the grain, lipids, fats, and it converts those. So over in Japan and the Far East, when they use or want to do conversion of grains, they will they'll steam grains, get them up to the gelatinization phase, and once it cools down, they will put koji on it and allow the koji to convert the glucans in the starch into fermentable sugar. And then a couple weeks later, they'll add some more steamed grains on top and some more water to keep growing this. And after you get to about 18%, then they'll distill it off, and then they got soju or shochu, depending on what you are looking for. It's a different process over there, but it's more specialized. In Japan, Amanda, we did this, and I gave you the the angel yeast yellow? The yellow label yeast, where you can put that into a match. You don't even have to convert your starches.
Yeah.
Given it time, it's got the aspergillus in there, which is the koji, that actually will convert the starches to fermentable sugars. And then the yeast will be a byproduct and start, chewing on those and making the alcohol.
And it also has alpha amylase added into it as well, I believe.
Yes. And rhizopus, which is basically another enzyme that breaks down, hard cells, or like, so it's kind of like breaking down dirt.
So these liquid enzymes, exogenous enzymes that we use, liquid, the high temp and all that, that is also derived from aspergillus, correct?
I think they're derived. And
amylase, maybe
like HT. I think they're derived from plant. They're like they pull them out of seaweed.
Okay, I thought I was reading on there where the Sebstar and HTL and the Sebamyl GL. I thought they were derived with they have some aspergillus in them, but I was not sure.
I thought they were seaweed. I thought they were seaweed.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm gonna have to look it up now.
Yeah. Now you're gonna make me write that down. Look it up too. Um, HDL. The one thing that's great about using koji is, I mean, you could put koji on rice, and it's a more neutral. It has its own flavor in Japan and its own profile. You have salty, sweet. It's called umami. It's its own flavor profile. So if you ever had soy sauce, it's kind of earthy.
Right.
So, I mean, if you were going to use koji on a mash, you'd start out using rice koji, and you allow that to convert your starches in your corn, and you keep growing that corn. It's like the pool of aspergillus or enzymes in aspergillus is like 5 times the pool of 2-row barley.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't grow; it's always there. But once it starts, changing everything around, it just creates the alcohol, so you can distill it off. But you do it in small batches. When I do aspergillus or koji, I'll do it a max of 8% of my total mash weight. That way, the umami flavor does not carry over or overpower whatever I'm doing it. Now, a good thing is, in Japan, there are 22 approved items that they can apply koji to. All your grains, seaweed, soybeans, kelp, shiitake mushrooms.
Mushrooms, really?
And each give a different flavor. In the U.S., we don't have those rules. Yeah, and in the U.S., we don't have those rules. So if I wanted, to do something with koji and a corn mash, I could get green coffee beans, steam them, add koji to them at the right appropriate time, let them sprout, kind of like we do with malting. And what happens is, like I said, that root goes through into the surface and actually becomes filamentous and spreads out, and it converts the proteins in that grain as well as the lipids to give you different flavors. So I'll add that to a mash, and that'll create a unique flavor profile for corn.
You got another question here. Says I'm a little curious on that yellow yeast. I can't talk tonight. Sorry. How much does that affect the overall taste of a bourbon?
So the yeast itself is a dry active distiller's yeast in there,
Right.
from what I've read, with added enzymes such as alpha amylase and koji. So the flavor profile can be affected based on the koji is what's changing the flavor profile and can create, which I can't really speak on the koji as well as Mike can, but I know it's a standard Saccharomyces cerevisiae dry active distiller's yeast, which has the added alpha amylase enzymes, which help to break down the starches in your mash. And then the koji also will help to break down those starches, which allows for cold fermentation, which can, or no cook fermentation and mash in, which can also affect fermentation times, right? Because it can extend your fermentation time quite a bit, which some people don't realize. If you cook it, you're going to have a standard fermentation time. If you cold mash it in and you're not cooking to break down those starches in your grains initially, it's going to take some time for that yellow label yeast to work and actually break down the starches for you, which people just, it could be 21 plus days for that fermentation, right? But that could extend. Cold, slow fermentation could bring out other flavors. Can you talk about the koji a little bit, Mike, and how that affects flavor in a fermentation?
Basically, it converts not just, or it creates the enzyme, but whatever the base material is. If you're using a starch like a barley or a rice, it creates a little bit of umami flavor because you're just using regular starches. But if you're using something that's higher in fat or has like soybeans, or it's not a lot of sugar in there, there's more lipids, there's more proteins. The koji converts the proteins in the soybeans or the lipids in the soybeans and provides a different flavor base.
It converts them into what
Whereas
exactly?
If you're using it on a starch base, a protease, like a different enzyme.
Okay.
Instead of amylase, it's protease. I forget what the other ones are, but there's different versions
Okay.
that create a different flavor.
Okay. And those enzymes that break down the starches or the sugars are creating different flavors than amylase enzymes.
They're creating
for
different
example.
flavors and they're creating different nutrients for the actual conversion.
Oh,
Interesting.
cool.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, I just somebody just gave me a brick of that yellow label, so I'm curious to play around with it. Would that be something that I might try blending with the yeast that I'm currently using?
Yeah, why not? Yeah, I mean, if you have yeast in there, like Amanda says, there's daddy yeast in yellow.
Yeah.
But I mean, literally, you can add something else to it. I mean, I'd throw the Kvike in there. I'd put maybe oh god, the
You
Horndale.
propagate yellow label yeast? I don't think so. If it's regular dry active distillers yeast, normally they're making like daddy or daddy and bread yeast. You can't really propagate that.
Yeah, and if you tried propagating the yellow label yeast, you would only be propagating the Saccharomyces.
Yeah.
The amylase, the rhizopus, those will not be propagating. They'll only be propagating on a starch.
So you'll lose all the benefits that yeast has.
Right.
Yeah. So co-pitching yeast is something you both just spoke about. And now there's benefits and then there are drawbacks to co-pitching yeast. There's ways to do it properly and there's ways that beginners can make mistakes. So co-pitching yeast means when you're using two different types of yeast. And sometimes using two different types of yeast at once can stall your fermentation because both types of yeast are competing for dominancy. So one is battling the other and they're not necessarily thriving, either one, and they're not making good alcohol for us. They're both being strained because they're fighting for dominancy in the fermentation. So if you co-pitch yeast, you have to make sure that you're co-pitching two types of yeast that are not going to fight for dominancy, one, or you could pitch them at different periods of time. For example, pitch one in the beginning, and then a few days later, when the activity starts to slow, pitch your another yeast at a later point in time. So as one yeast begins very active, and then it may reach an alcohol tolerance and begin to slow down, then you throw in another yeast, and it can pick up where that one left off. But yeast is two different types of yeast will fight for dominancy, which is why when we're done mashing in a mash, we are told to cold crash that mash and introduce our strain, our yeast to that mash. If you let your mash sit overnight to cool down for 12 plus hours, it's in a bacteria zone. So wild foreign yeasts are going to grow on your mash. And then when you go to pitch your yeast is going to try to activate. It's going to try to get strong in that environment. And it's going to have to fight the foreign yeasts or the wild yeast that have already taken over. So we want to make sure we cold crash a mash when we're done cooking our grains or melting our sugar, getting our fruit ready. When we're done doing that mash, before you leave for the day, make sure you bring your mash to a temperature which foreign or wild yeast can't take over first. Because if it does, it's going to slow or impede your fermentation and it's going to stress your yeast. So co-pitching can be done properly and it can be done in a way that hurts your fermentation. Do you want to talk about how to do a healthy co-pitch?
Yeah. Dame, can you go to slide number 8?
No, we're still on. I'm still on.
And we're coming up on, we just passed an hour and a half, so we're going to have to start winding her down here pretty quick. But yeah, do talk about the co-pitch. Sir.
All right, here's a co-pitch chart. This is basically a wild yeast and convect. And like Amanda says, after the first couple days, you got the you guys can't see me. You have the wild pitch in the beginning. And that...
Let's say hi.
No.
Say hi. You want to say hi? Go ahead. That's my grandmom. She says hi.
Hey, grandmom.
Hi.
Sorry, Mike.
That's all right. No, you're golden. Anything for a Philly girl. So you see how Amanda says doing it the right way. If you underpitch a yeast, you can cause stress. If you overpitch, you can cause more stress and you create more solvents. So you have to do it at the right levels. And like Amanda says, you can do it at different intervals. Now, on here, you'll see on the very bottom left, that blue line is the wild yeast strain. And then What's that? Okay, so the blue line that's going up, that's the wild yeast. And you notice how the alcohol kind of is slow on the start. The wild yeast isn't eating much because we're building up a lot of esters at that point. Once we do the secondary pitch of the Quebec, everything takes off, and the Quebec really eats and capitalizes on the wild yeast's esters. So basically what's happening in that point is the wild yeast is creating your initial ester points that once the Quebec comes in, it's going to build on top. So it's going to use them as a new starting point rather than going from an old starting point. So you can actually create new ester profiles by actually staggering the yeast strain as they go in, just like Amanda said.
What yeast would you recommend? Say someone is at home and they want to learn how to co-pitch, or they want to play around with different types of yeast, different from the dry active distillers yeast and bread yeast. Could you recommend a kind of yeast that they could purchase, or any type of co-pitching with dry active distillers yeast and another yeast? And what benefits would that give somebody at home? In layman's terms, basically, like, say I have Daddy and that's what I'm used to using, but I want to play with another yeast and I want to either switch to that yeast entirely or use them both at the same time. How would I go about doing that?
I'd go with something that's, like a cream ale blend, something that has a medium flocculation, but it's got a high attention rate. So if you're putting them together with a Daddy, you want something that will handle some of the high alcohols as well, something in the 10% range, 10 to 12%. Mm-hmm. That way they complement each other, and you can work with each one to build off of. Yeah. Then if you really want to get experimental, that's when you start looking at the high gravity stuff, and do the high gravity malts instead of adding sugars. That way, you start off doing like a San Diego blend or something like that, and then you throw in your Daddy on top of that, or the Quebec on top. I'm a big Quebec guy. I mean, I have like six strains of Quebec, so I use a lot of the Quebec.
Why do you like Quebec? What do you find is beneficial about Quebec compared to other yeasts? What makes that so special?
It's stronger. It's harder to breed a Quebec. So if I do two strains together and then I repitch them, the Quebec will take over. The only way you can breed a Quebec is if you isolate it, and separate them in different petri dishes, treat them with chemicals, do a wash, and then put them together and see how they work on your next batch. If they do blend and crossbreed, it's not really crossbreeding because it's at certain life points in the life cycle of a yeast, it expels proteins and it absorbs proteins, and you try and match it up so that when it does happen, you can merge the two together and you can create a hybrid strain. I really like Quebec the way it takes off, the flavors, the profiles. You can actually control, and it's harder to actually crossbreed it with something else.
Okay. It's good for people that are in a warm climate. Quebec yeast really likes warm fermentation temperatures. So I have students who are in Texas. Some people are actually air conditioning their fermentation rooms. They have to keep it like temperature control because of how hot it gets. It can get hot in certain places that it will kill a standard yeast. So the Quebec yeast is ideal if you're in a very warm climate. It's also good for honey fermentation, right, Mike? Because that's the reason Mike introduced me to the Quebec. He overnighted a bunch to me for a master distiller competition that I was in and taught me to use that for honey. So when we're fermenting honey, we are using up all the residual sugars in the honey. We're removing what is sweet about honey, and what's left behind is the earthiness of honey. So if you use a regular standard yeast with honey fermentation, one, honey is very expensive. Two, we're going to remove all the residual sweetness when what's left behind is earthy and maybe what the bees have eaten. And if you were to taste an alcohol made with a different type of yeast, you wouldn't even recognize it as honey at all. However, if you use the Quebec yeast for honey fermentation, it's going to do several things for your fermentation. Honey fermentation will take 21 days, similar to molasses. The Kveik yeast can make that work off in 5 to 7 days. It's going to help carry over residual sweetness or mouthfeel on your final distillate. It's also going to bring over floral and fruity notes in a honey fermentation. And I think I found, and other people have found too, that if we want to choose to bring Kveik into like our fermentation to play with it, it's going to bring out beneficial flavors that maybe weren't there with a standard dry active distiller's yeast. Your daddy dry active distiller's yeast is going to create neutral flavor. Bread yeast will create a bready or a corn type of flavor, and then the Kveik can create floral or fruity flavors and aromas in a fermentation. So that's personally why I like it. And it helps with the fermentation to be very healthy. It can speed up fermentation times, not in a stressed way, but in a healthy way. So not like comparing that to turbo yeast, where they're forcing and straining the fermentation, creating all flavors. Kveik yeast can have a faster fermentation with harder to ferment sugars like honey, but create beneficial flavors. And some people play with the temperatures, purposely giving it a warm fermentation can create more in-depth of flavor profiles in the Kveik yeast. Right. The opposite of that is there's different types of yeast if you're in a cold climate, which is a issue for a lot of people that are fermenting or watching right now. It's winter time where most of us are. I had a friend call me yesterday morning and discuss how he is having a hard time fermenting anything where he's at in Colorado right now because it's so bitter cold. He's using all kinds of heat sources that he can find, but his fermentation is still struggling where it's located. So I suggested that he find a cold fermenting yeast, and he hadn't thought about that. So I just quickly, something that also I don't really run into this issue. I've never switched to an intentionally cold fermenting yeast, but I found lager and ale yeasts work really good depending on which type of yeast, because some can go down to 48 degrees. Do you have any recommendations for cold fermenting yeast or someone who's struggling with cold temperatures?
Yeah, I'd like the lager yeasts are the top ones, but the thing is, lager yeasts are the most expensive. Yeah, I mean, you're looking at maybe, if I remember correctly, they were $12, $14 for a 5-gallon batch. So you have to propagate those. I like to take my wild yeast and create my own. And like I said, use that advanced laboratory evolution to actually bring it down to the right temperature. I've done, temperatures where, I just leave it sit over the middle of winter, and I can go in there, open it, and it's every once in a while I see bubbles coming up, not major bubbles, but you're like, oh my, hey, it's still working.
So, Oshin asked, he said, last question from me, but do you see yeast tenders coming back to the mainstream now that the focus is shifting in the industry to craft spirits? I definitely think so. A good friend of all of ours, Alan Bishop, he does propagate and use his own yeast. So basically he is taking on that yeast tender role as a distiller. And I think, I know in the craft industry, I think I do see it coming. What do you guys think?
Definitely a way for us as a distiller, right? I think for each of us, if we're really into the craft of distilling, it's kind of like an art form. And being able to tend your own yeast is definitely a way that you can impact or just get another layer of depth into our craft. We can really get physical and hands-on with another factor that affects our final product. So being able to propagate your yeast, play with yeast strains, force your yeast to evolve, like Mike said, to survive cold temperatures, to eat certain types of sugar like molasses, honey, rye, to bring out different flavors for us in the fermentation is how we can just take another layer and just get a little bit more in depth into our craft and kind of control the fermentation and our spirit production as a whole. I think the more you care about your spirit, the more, I say, nerdy that we all get, where we're caring about our ingredients, sourcing our ingredients, maintaining our fermentation, and then tending or propagating your own yeast is just another step where starting out, I recommend everyone use a standard yeast. Get used to that yeast, like bread yeast. Everybody has bread yeast. It's the most common yeast. It works perfectly fine. It gives good flavor. I recommend everyone use that. Once you get used to using that and you find out what is that, that's a baseline for you. You learn what that tastes like and how it behaves and how it acts. Then you can build on that. You can try a daddy yeast. You can try a Kveik yeast. But you got to learn your baseline first and what that is, and then build off of that.
I agree. I've seen Alan. Alan goes nuts with the yeast. He's very big on his Donna jugs.
Yes.
Donna jug, Dona, or how I don't ever say. And like you said, Amanda. I mean, that's the purveyors, the distillers were the yeast wranglers of their town growing up. You know, the bakers. If you needed yeast, you went to the yeast wrangler, or the brewer, or the thing. I think being a tender of your own yeast, I mean, for me personally, if I want certain flavors of my spirits, I start with the yeast. What does the yeast I have propagated, what does that produce? Do I want more stone fruit? Do I want more banana? Do I want more pear? All right, then, okay, I know what type of esters I want to get. All right, now I know what type of esters. Now, what kind of corn am I going to use? Am I going to use yellow dent corn? Am I going to use, Oaxacan, Lenny Lenape? I mean, what kind of oats am I going to use? And go from there and start building out. It's not putting everything together and see what you get. It's where do I want to be in the end, and how am I going to get there? How am I going to build it with the oak? Is it going to be, toasted? Is it going to be charred 3? Is it going to be this water or these grains? But the yeast itself, I believe, and I'm going to get yelled at for this, but I believe the barrel only gives you like 45% of the flavor.
Bingo. I
think the yeast gives you about 30%. Damon, can you go to slide 30? And I'm going to catch crap for this. I know I'm going to catch crap because Lou Bryson always says 80% comes from the barrel. I mean, yeah, if 80% came from the barrel, my thinking is
it can, but do you want it to?
Well, I mean,
right. You don't.
Yeah. No, it's the pie chart, the one right before that. Yeah, that's kind of breakdown that I look at. I mean, you're getting 30% from your yeast. So once people start realizing it's the yeast and it's the grains that can actually, get you to where you want to be, and the barrel is going to kind of help guide you there as well. I mean, they're all combined. But you need to define it in the beginning. And defining it in the beginning is going to be through your grains and your yeast. Are you malting all your grains? Are you using enzymes, sugars and stuff like that? I mean, you have to build out your mash bill. What's it going to ferment, or what do you want it to ferment like? And then you can put it in the barrels and let that age come through. And the barrel can actually enhance everything you've built in that first beginning.
Would you say step 1 is what is my fermentable ingredient? Step 2 is that I base on my fermentable ingredient to choose the type of yeast I want to use? Would you agree with that?
No, step 1 for me is always what do I want? What do I want? I want what flavor do I want on the end? Do I want to have citrus? Do I want to have spice? Do I want to have apples? Do I want to have a floral essence? Maybe I'll use a Quebec, a Voss to get me more citrus, and then I'll match that up with a pink hoppy corn, and to give some of the floral fruitiness. And then I'll only, I'll use some type of different malt. Other than a distiller's 2-row, I might use a lighter, paler malt, or might add in there a crystal malt to give it an additional sweetness.
Yeah. Personally, for me, I start with an ingredient, and then that's how I choose my yeast. Because if I'm going to ferment fruit or I'm going to ferment grains, I may choose a different yeast depending on what ingredients do I have. And most commonly when I go to start a mash, sometimes I'll go out and source my ingredients to make a specific recipe, but most commonly I'm using what I have on hand. So I work with what I have to work with. I choose my yeast based on that. And then I go through the thought process in my head. And that may be helpful for a lot of people that are like, what is the right kind of yeast do I use? So ask yourself, what am I trying to ferment? Yeah. And Freddie, real quick, the yeast I was talking about was called 1895C. We're also talking about Kvike yeast. What I can do is I have a post I made for my students in my class where it's a list of all different yeasts for different ingredients. So it's what is the right yeast for the job, and it talks about yeast for rye grain, yeast for apples, yeast for grapes, and then it talks about what that yeast does for you and how it benefits you. I can send that to you, Freddie, and if there's a way to share that in the comments or anybody wants that list, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to share it. It's a pretty extensive list, so it's not something I think I can just drop in the comment section, but it's already typed up and ready to go so that I can stop repeating it to everyone. It's just if I want to ferment this ingredient, this is a recommended yeast for that ingredient types list.
Yeah, I think the last time I did any type of fruit, oh my God. No, I shouldn't say that because we have, I don't know, 1,200 gallons of peaches. But I mean, we just basically threw the peaches in a barrel, took a blender to them, and.
Oh, question for peaches.
Go ahead.
How did you process large amount of peaches and remove the pits? Did you remove the pits? And is it necessary to remove the pits? Is amalgamide toxic enough to harm a human being?
Good question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to answer that way?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Me personally, the amount of peaches. I mean, because Amanda, you haven't been to the farm, have you? We had that spelled for you. Oh
Yeah, I
yeah.
haven't
Okay.
been there yet.
Okay. The amount of peaches we had, I have on one farm, I think about 20 55-gallon drums that we filled up with peaches. By the canning house, we have a tote filled all the way with peaches and another 10 55-gallon drums. We started taking the pits out. At the certain point, we're like, forget it. We're done.
Yeah.
It's impossible. If you ferment them properly, the pits will all fall to the bottom of your mash tote or your mash tun or your barrels. And I just have this as a touchy topic because I recently processed a large amount of peaches, and it was like some people were like, it's fine. So there is stone fruit liqueur. There's actual alcohol made of stone fruit where they were purposely using the flavor from the stone fruit because it has a complexity of flavor. Yes. Certain brandies, the stone fruit is left in it to a certain amount because it will give a complexity of flavor. Some old-time moonshiners are intentionally leaving the stones in the fruit behind. They're also not able to remove all the stone from the fruit. So it's not going to hurt you in fermentation. Most of the time when it ferments, the solids are going to fall to the bottom. Those pits are going to fall right to the bottom. So if you siphon your mash off the top, you're not going to get all the stone fruit in there. What the stone fruit can do is it can create too much of a flavor impact. It can change, for example, if you're doing peach brandy, it can change. Too much stone fruit can create an intense flavor of almonds.
Yes.
There's old almond extract made from this. So the chemical that is in cherry pits, apple seeds, stone fruit, it is not cyanide. It is amalgamide. And people think it's cyanide. Oh, you can't have that. It's going to kill you. So it's not. It's amalgamide. Amalgamide can be converted into cyanide if it's processed properly. You have to break the stone fruits, and then you have to, through a process of crushing, heating, and extracting, and concentrating, and then purifying the cyanide, right? So even when we distill alcohol, it's not pure ethanol alcohol. Right. It's not pure acetyl alcohol. None of it is pure. They're in small concentrations. And the cyanide is not pure or concentrated. A scientist or a chemist could concentrate the cyanide in stone fruit through a series of distillations and purifications to bring it to a purification level that could harm a human being. But us at home making a small mash on our scale, whether we're fermenting cherries with stone fruit or peaches with the pits in them, we're never going to come to a level that's going to harm us. And most of the time, it's okay if it's in the fermentation. Avoid getting a large amount of it in your still, which we don't want to have solids in the still anyway, most of us. Right. Even if it's steam, you let the solids fall to the bottom, leave the stone in the fermenter, but it's not going to hurt you. I've been trying to research even like mass amounts of production of plums. How do you mass produce plums? How do you mass produce peaches? There has to be a more efficient way than just doing it by hand.
Yeah, if
right?
you watch what they're doing in Europe, slivovitz and all that stuff. It's guts, feathers, and all.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny you talk about cherries because we have I think 4 55-gallon drums filled with cherries, and I let them sit. I think this is going on the second year because I didn't have time to run them. I opened them up when I was up there hunting. It smelled like chocolate in 2 of them.
Interesting. We got to run that then.
Oh yeah, I'm waiting for that. But I'm using a Bain Marie too, so I can actually put the pits in.
Yeah.
And all the solids, so I'm good.
Yeah.
I think real quick, let's go over a list before we get off the topic of yeast. I want people at home to feel comfortable in what yeast is, playing with different kinds of yeast, and understand why we would change our yeast. What does that yeast do for us? Different kinds of yeast have different benefits, and those benefits could be for specifically different ingredients that we're using. Different types of yeast can survive different alcohol tolerances. So that means you can feed it more or less sugar. If you have a yeast that can survive 12% alcohol, you can't give it 20% sugar and expect it to make 20% alcohol for you because it will never survive and it will never do that. So the amount of sugar we put in our mash is dictated by what your yeast can tolerate, alcohol tolerancy. So there's different alcohol tolerancy is one. You can choose it for temperature tolerancy. Where am I at? What kind of temperature do I have? So when choosing your yeast, make sure that you're able to maintain an optimal temperature for that yeast. Because if you can't, you're going to stress the fermentation. And then you can look at what kind of benefits it gives to the flavor. Because if you look up yeast properties, it's going to tell you this yeast produces mango, banana,
Clove.
cider,
Right.
Right.
I have a spreadsheet that I've done. Amanda, I can send you that spreadsheet. I got a list of mostly White Labs yeast strains because they have the best selection. Distilling subset out of them. The different types of Quebec yeast that are out on the market, not just White Labs, but everybody that's out there. It also has another spreadsheet with lacto in there, lacto available. Brettanomyces is another spreadsheet. Also within that is Koji spreadsheet, and then the natural high ABV type of yeast strains that are out there. I can send this to you, and you can share it with everybody. It kind of gives you, like you're saying, your name, your strain, your attenuation, flocculation, temperature range, and flavor profile. So I can send that to you. You can send it on.
Cool. Yeah. And what I do personally, like if I see a new yeast, it may not say it on the package. I will just Google the name of that yeast and the properties. And there is on that website, whatever lab created that yeast, is a list of all the details that you need to know about it. How long does it take to ferment? What kind of level of attenuation? What kind of level of flocculation? It's all listed there for you, and as well as directions on how to pitch that yeast and how to use it. But again, I recommend that people start out with an easy to use yeast. Use your standard bread yeast. Use a Daddy. Daddy is great. It's fairly reliable. It will give you consistent results. And that's the most common yeast I see people using, especially in distilleries, because for consistency. But get that base level so that you know what is your average fermentation going to be like. And then you can change and do something new, and then it's an experiment. You have something to compare it to, and you can say, wow, this gave me different flavor. Use the same mash that you've always used. Do your standard corn liquor, right? Sugar, water, corn, yeast. Do bread yeast. And then eventually one day throw a Kvike yeast at it. Then you can, in your mind, you know what the bread yeast has always done for you. And you can go back and compare what is the Kvike yeast doing differently. You can see if it made more alcohol, if it worked off more quickly, if it worked off at a higher temperature. Some yeast actually ferment like at a warm temperature. Some yeasts do what's called like a foam, where it's like a very thin or low foam, where it just, it's clean fermenting and it doesn't push up a big cap. Some yeasts push up a big cap and make a mess everywhere. But you gotta practice with your standard yeasts, get that under your belt, and then you can progress so that you have something to compare it to.
Yeah, I think we could probably go on and on, and we could probably do a whole nother episode.
It's a rabbit hole.
Yeah, it is. And it's been really good, but we're going to have to wrap it up. We're at 2 hours.
Yeah.
But great conversation, guys. And like I said, it would be so easy to sit here and talk for another 2 hours. and
But nobody's going to join us for that long.
Yeah, nobody's going to hang around that long. I thank everybody for coming out and showing up and watching us and listening to what we're talking about with the yeast. There are so many things that we really wanted to cover in here that we still haven't even scratched the surface on. So, maybe we'll end up doing another one. I had a suggestion that we do one on pH and its effect on the mash fermentation. So there's a lot of different things we can cover, but anyway, I think we're gonna have to wrap this one up. So thank you guys for joining me tonight. It's been awesome. Great conversation. Thank you, Woody, for coming on, dude. It's your knowledge is just
no, thanks for inviting me. Pleasure's all mine, guys. Really, I really enjoyed that. I mean, a lot of times there's a lot, like you said, a lot of information, especially on yeast. I mean, there's tons of yeast strains out there. Each yeast strain gives you different things and can do different things. So, I mean, like Amanda says, find what you like. Work with the daddy. Just so you guys know, the reason why it was called daddy yeast is not because it's dried active distiller's yeast. It was invented in 1993 at Mobil Oil Corporation, and the reason it was called Daddy Yeast is because there was a radio DJ. His name was the Grease Man, and he was along the lines of like Howard Stern. And one of his favorite lines was, "Who's your daddy? Who's your daddy?" So when listening to that, and all yeasts were mothers, we called it the daddy yeast, and that's what Bruce called it. That's why it's called Daddy Yeast. After that, I think the company was ACH. It was a corn conglomerate down out of Bucks County. They worked with us. They worked with White Labs, and they took the yeast strain over. So that's my belief. What we called Daddy Yeast when I was working with Mobil.
All right.
That's a good story. I like that. Wayne, where can we find you? Tell us about Ozark Stillworks.
Okay, yeah, we're on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and all over the Moonshine Militia on Facebook. We put stuff out there all the time. What about you, Amanda?
I'm on Facebook. I'm at ubdistilling.com. I have a distilling school where I teach classes once a month. We're looking at expanding those classes because I'm having a hard time. I have more demand for classes than I have seats, so I'm trying to expand that somehow. But yes, we're teaching classes at ubdistilling.com. You can contact me on Facebook. I'm on YouTube. And I'm happy I try to answer any genuine distilling questions that I had that you can send me.
Mike? How about you, Woody?
Yeah, I'll be hiding underneath my desk or on my phone. No.
Mr. TikTok.
I'm on TikTok, Instagram, Distiller Woody, Facebook. Just anybody has any questions for me, yeast, malting, anything, koji, big on koji. Hit me up, man.
Yep, that's probably going to happen. I imagine a lot of people's going to hit you up now.
I'm there.
Yeah.
I got nothing
Definitely hit this guy up. He'll help you because he's helped me throughout my whole education of self-educating myself. He's a person that I've gone to numerous times and relied on, and he has answered tons of questions for me, and I'm grateful for that.
Yeah. That's because you put the questions in multiple, choice format, and I can easily answer.
I'll also be on next week's episode of Moonshiner. I forgot.
Awesome.
McGillis shared my video link, so I have to shout them out. We're going to be on Moonshiners next week.
Right,
we're going to be playing with some peaches.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. One of my favorite fruits. All right. Well, it's been great, y'all. So we're going to cut it here.
Appreciate that all.
Thanks for watching,
Thanks everyone
everybody.
for watching.
Love
you guys
y'all.
rock. You're amazing.
Peace out.
Refreshing.
Oh, wait, are we still rolling?
Oh!